purpose of this panel isn't really to conclude anything, but we wanted to kind of just pull out some of the key themes, ideas, I think, and open things up for the future, because what's really struck me about this event is really the level of originality, of fresh thinking, of a lot of hope about what else is to do. And I think, again, we were talking about the work that exhibitions do in bringing new audiences to meet artists and ideas, and new generations as well, who perhaps have never seen these works before. And because a lot of work is from private collections as well, we're seeing things, I feel like, in a really fresh way. So I think that's really what we just want to do. You've met several of the people on the panel already, because they've been serving and working hard throughout the 2 days. But of course, we've got Carol Jacobi, the lead curator of the exhibition, and also been working incredibly hard in the other part of your role as a curator of British art here on the rehang. So I thought that could be something we could touch on as well, the relationship between what we see in the exhibitions and how British art of the pre-Raphaelite and after period is thought about and displayed. See, Professor Tim Barringer, Paul Mellon Professor at Yale University. And then we're also joined by Caitlin Beach, who's Assistant Professor at Fordham University and hasn't spoken or been a chair. So we're getting really fresh thinking from Caitlin. And then Professor Liz Prettejohn, who is from the University of York and one of our collaborators and partners on this conference. And it's been really interesting as well. I've noticed, obviously, the work of Liz and Tim and Carol and many other people in this room generously cited and quoted in the papers we've heard. And I do feel that what's interesting for me as well is seeing a community of scholarship here. And it really does feel generous and generative. So I just asked our panellists to maybe reflect for a few minutes on Rossetti's in relation, and maybe pull out a theme or an idea or an object which has kind of arisen during our conversations, and what thinking in relation has meant or has done for you. So Liz, I'm going to pick on you and ask you to start us off with those ideas.
Okay, well, something that I've already said is I think we're only at the very start of finding new relations for the Rossettis, and that this does actually open up a huge volume of new research. We still are looking at only, a tiny percentage, I suspect probably less than 1% of the really great primary material that's out there. And of course, one of the great pleasures of the show is that it does bring out some drawings, especially works of art that many of us have never seen before. And Carol, I'm going to have to pick your brains about how you found some of these amazing objects that haven't been sort of, mulled over and repeatedly worked over in the literature before. But there's so much more like that. And in the textual sources, we still are quoting, there's, some of those great quotations that you just cannot resist because they're so wonderful. And we've all got our favorite bit of Ruskin Rossetti or whatever. But and we must keep those. But there's still way more to do. And we mentioned before the publication of the Friedman edition of the complete Rossetti letters, which is sort of it brings up interlocutors of hundreds that are not really adequately represented. So that's certainly something that there is more to do. Now, I'm just going to contradict everything I just said and say that the thing that's come out as interesting, particularly today in the papers, is that it is still actually Dante Gabriel Rossetti that is the catalyst for what happens here. Now, I don't know if that, whether that's because, I do think Rossetti was that person was an amazing person for making things happen around him, and the way that the works of art that happen around him, it kind of often, in some ways, sort of can be more powerful, interesting, and wonderful than anything he ever made himself, in possibly in some ways. But things happen around Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and I do think that's come out rather strongly. And we need to, I think we're a little vexed about what to do about Dante Gabriel Rossetti now. I mean, Carol said at the beginning, it's certainly evident in some of those reviews, there's the hatred. And it is hate. I mean, we talk about hate crime and so forth. I think it's that kind of thing. It is this irrational. And where's that coming from? And what do we now do next with Dante Gabriel Rossetti? I think that's a really important question.
Thank you so much, Liz. Thank you. Caitlin.
Sure, yeah. So I think that's something that's come up for me both in viewing the exhibition and then hearing the papers, is thinking about, which many have touched on, is thinking about the Rossettis in relation to empire and Orientalism. And a term that kept coming to my mind, in addition to relationality and relation, is kind of thinking through like the framework of intimacy. And this is kind of, thinking about the work of people like Lisa Lowe or Hazel Carby, who've thought about sort of imperial intimacies, and how thinking through intimacy might make space for us to think about the relations between bodies and objects, as well as objects that are commodified by bodies because of, the race or gender dynamics of capitalism. And so this morning's conversation about the props in the paintings, or kind of the paper that talked about the musical instruments, was really interesting to think about, like, how bodies are placed in such intimate relationship to objects that introduce this question of Orientalism. So that's really interesting to me. And I think the other question that I would have kind of for the other folks up here, as well as people here, is just was spurred by the very last paper on Gaelic mythologies, and the ways that the Rossettis and the Pre-Raphaelites are received in colonial contexts, and how are they framed, especially in light of kind of questions about Englishness or Britishness. So those are kind of some of the questions I have.
Yeah, and actually just picking up on some of the threads about, future, what do we do? It's interesting to think about context of teaching this material as well, and how students are responding to those questions and framing these questions differently themselves as well. So I think that may be something we might want to pick up on about future thinking. Tim, do you want to follow on?
Yes. Well, the first thing is just to congratulate Carol and the Tate for putting this show on at all. I mean, Rossetti had to wait till he was dead to get a show at the RA, and the Tate has significantly avoided putting on a Rossetti retrospective. It's been an absolutely glaring hole in the institution's history. I mean, there was a Andrew Wilton show on British symbolism, which was a sort of way of getting Rossetti into a very uncomfortable context that didn't really make sense of his earlier work. So thank you for doing that. I mean, it's really significant. So thank you. I mean, I would say still that, not that it's listening, but this institution has never really taken Victorian artists. I'm sure, Carol, you fight this battle every single day. It still hasn't realised that the golden age of British art was 1837 to 1901. Eventually it will do so, but we will keep pushing that. I mean, I also want to thank Jan Marsh, actually. Where is Jan?
She just nipped out.
She nipped out, typical. Well, anyway, I saw the show in Sheffield of Elizabeth Siddal in the days when she had 2 L's in her name, as I believe she still should, because she comes from Sheffield. But anyway, in 1991, and that was an incredibly important moment in just establishing a canon and allowing people to see these works which are so small but so enormously powerful. As we've gathered through the exhibition and the paper. So that these things are historiographically really serious. I like the idea of relationality as a model for decentering artistic production from the great man to a wider circle. Would love to have seen the Maddox Browns in the show, all of them, especially the women. And I think that's perhaps the next expansion. And you can go on expanding the relationality until the hundreds of people that Liz mentions are all in the diagram. I was thinking, I think it was Wendy's diagram, or there was a diagram on screen of connections, and one could imagine 1,000 names with lines putting them all together, and that might be a way forward. The only thing with the relationality concept, which I don't think we've we've suffered from in this conference has been really generative, but the danger is to reinscribe the biographical as the driving force. And that was the problem with the 1984 exhibition, which is what made Liz and me into pre-Raphaelite scholars. We could have had perfectly profitable careers in other professions if this institution hadn't mounted a show in 1984.
You were happy as accountants before that, weren't you?
Terrible. Useless, but never mind. That first year undergraduate, seeing that show, was transformative, and I hope seeing your show will transform, a generation who are now 19 years old and looking at this. I'm sure it will. But it did take the life stories as the key to it. And so, can we make an agreement not to use Lizzie and Janie and pubic hair ever again as part of the pre-Raphaelite story? That focus on biography, I think, is problematic. And I think we should perhaps now return to having defined them. Sophie's kindly reinscribed the definition of pre-Raphaelitism and aestheticism as perhaps, movement names which allow us to think through connections between artists in ways that are not biographical or instantiated by personal narrative. So I think that would be important. But then in coming back to those big categories, what is the way that they look different now from 1984 or from 2012 when Alison Smith and Jason Rosenfeld and I did the show here? I think queerness is really important. I think the way that national institutions reinscribe heteronormative concepts against the curator's will, for example, by putting particular images on the front of books, is really extraordinary. I mean, we fought really hard to have a different image as the image for the 2012 show. And the director of Tate Britain was overruled by the head of marketing, who was higher in the somehow in the Tate stratosphere, and they insisted on having Jane Morris's thyroids on the front of the catalogue. And that, it makes the pre-Raphaelites into one thing. But what if you were to think about its particularly aestheticism through the work of Grace Lavery, this brilliant recent book, Quaint Exquisite, as if not a manifestation of queer sexuality, then as a manifestation of potentially of queer cultural affect across a range of media. And that, I think, is my last point, is that a paintings and drawings show with a couple of decorative arts objects is a wonderful thing to see. But what if the balance were shifted to return to a greater sense of intermediality, in the future, and to kind of bring a bit more of the V&A to Tate and a bit more of the Tate to V&A, and to get the balance between the three-dimensional and the two-dimensional and the architectural and the interior and the installation and the physical object into greater balance with that which is flat and imagined on a flat surface. So those seem to me to be some of the ways forward if we think again with the concepts pre-Raphaelite and aesthetic, which have been so generative. But maybe to think in 3 dimensions and to think outside heteronormative sexual categories.
Thank you.
Carol, do you want to take up on there?
Yeah, so I think the relational theme that emerged was striking and quite exhilarating insistence across all the papers is this breakdown of binaries, which touches a little bit on what Tim was saying. And this sort of, these, we were using these words slippage, erosion. I find these words really exciting. And the sort of toing and froing across boundaries, whether that's the lips, a kiss, or whether it's countries, as we saw in the last panel. And also the way that sort of themes cross panels. So that sort of complicating of the racial themes of Natalie's paper, the first paper, the way that spoke to Marta's paper and the two musicians and the discussion of the two musicians in that. And I think this mutability, for me, it's really energized the works. Whether we're talking paintings and poems, or keepsakes or counterpanes, especially works which perhaps I'm guilty of becoming quite fixed in my thinking about. And it sort of really was energizing. I thought that was really great. And so, well, one example is this sort of strong theme that's come out quite sort of unexpectedly in lots of areas of gender mutability. So again, in Nat's paper, in Thomas's paper, but also in Tara's paper, you know, where she presented the girlhood of the Virgin as a kind of denial of sort of traditional male positions about what artistic work is, which I thought was really amazing. And so, sort of to come to some of the themes that I sort of touched on at the beginning of the conference, I think this is the 20th century nature of our perspectives and a sense of freedom to think the unthinkable. I really love that. All kinds of really surprising ideas, but the way that is, the authenticity of that is preserved by at the same time a really close attention to the 19th century sources that we've had over the last 2 days, and an amazing expansion of those sources. So looking at all kinds of new kinds of texts and objects as sources, again from keepsakes to a musical instrument, and in particular, there's just been such a wealth, such a sort of almost relaxed feeling of women as being absolutely, as being central in the papers, women's voices being central in the papers. And I think this has also been allied to a degree of close reading, again across the panels, and it's really close material engagement with the sources. So the reference to the haptic, to hands, and actually was something with the exhibition I didn't really mention, was something that excites me every time I go in it, and I keep boring everyone with it, is the hands, and every single hand in that exhibition is different, and every single one is telling you about some really complicated relationships at moments that are going on. So that sort of incredibly physical focus that we've had, I think there's a lot of future in that. It's a really exciting departure. So for example, just thinking about the finger about to pluck a string on a musical instrument and the whole transformation that that's going to bring about. And so my final point is that I think that in so doing, the papers have been really in sympathy with their subject matter. So, for example, close looking, one of the images that I'm going to walk away with from this conference is that image that I know so well, but I saw it new with Deborah's paper, of Fra Angelico's nose so close to that canvas. And, this is what the Prophets did. They were physically really close to what they were painting. They had to be to see the gleam on the fingernail. And that sort of close looking, both in a physical way, but also, I think, in a psychological way. And there's been a lot of that going on, which is very, very in sympathy with the subject matter. And I think, and that's what I wanted to say, really. I think that the directions and the emphases that we've seen in this conference, there are 21st perspectives, but I think they're also found 19th century perspectives. I think they are there. So to take gender mutability as an example, it is there. The talisman for me is John Everett Millais' portrait of himself as the nun St. Agnes. And that little object gives me permission to explore this gender mutability that everyone's been finding in the works, and which has been really fascinating. And I think that is also something that's very now. Peter Trippi asked me last night, what is the strangest question, or what is the question that stood out for you from members of the public in the exhibition? And I thought about it overnight, and actually the question that keeps coming up over and over again is, all the women, not why do all the women, but just stating all the women look like men. And, this is what people are seeing. It's something that's really interesting, and it's something very now, but I think it's also something very then. And we've got a long way to go with it, as Tim says. And also the other thing is this idea of work, this idea that of this incredible close engagement with the making of the painting, and especially this idea of Rossetti, this new idea of Rossetti. It's not as a dilettante, but as a workaholic that's come out. I just want to finish by sort of making a sort of doffing my hat to our conservation team and their amazing Rossetti project that they did in the run-up to the exhibition, where they did technical examination of all our Rossettis, and they just found these sort of lots and lots of rubbing out. I can't remember who was talking about rubbing out, but, you know, cutting right from the beginning of his career to the end, cutting up, patching. There's again this textile aspect of it. It's this constant changing and perfectionism and obsession, which they've revealed about his work. So those are the things I wanted to bring forward, and I think we've got a long way to go.
I think that also speaks to all the labour and all that work that goes on prior to an exhibition as well. Again, we're sort of using it as you've given us this springboard, and we're thinking, what next? I think that, Tim, as you're speaking, I'm thinking, can an exhibition, can a physical space do that? Or do we need to bring, the digital in to help us map all these possibilities and collate these sources together? And then as you're speaking, Carol, thinking all that conservation work, all that preparation, all that, the labour and the diligence of preparing something that then you give, and make public. So.
And I can't remember who made the point, but this is this workaholism and this slightly ambivalent relationship between work as pleasure and tyranny, it is such a now thing, isn't it, for us? I can't remember who said that, was a really good point.
Because there's been a real generous community of response in the room, and I have really felt that with the panels. We've opened up, again, like I say, I go to many conferences. Sometimes, you have the tumbleweed moments. No one's asking a question. At this conference, it's amazing. There's if you're a chair, you're met with a sea of hands. I'm going to be contradicted now. Everyone's thinking it's nearly time to go. But I think I just want to open the floor and already I can see, just for observations about the whole, the whole event or whatever you'd like to say. Here we go. There's a microphone heading your way.
I think I said yesterday there was a couple of places I wanted to go. One is Delaware. I realised that I've got quite right. And there are many great things we owe to Delaware. And I'm not going to elaborate on them, but we should be more grateful that we are. But it's an amazing collection you've got there. But there are other great people who travel back on the train after family circumstances. And I think we personally owe them a great deal. I think one of the things, just something I thought in the previous conversation, when I go around the corner from me, I see Art Nouveau and arts and crafts, and it's always a question of how this art disseminates to ordinary people. And they've got the stained glass. I could just show you a street where it alternates between one and the other. And I think that we sort of see these things in opposition to each other, but clearly these houses were built at the same time as Oscar Wilde moved into his house in Tate Street before he left it for London forever, and we see them as sort of opposites. And I think one thing we don't realise is, I would have elaborated, but I think we see them as opposites, and actually it was a time of enormous change, and actually these people were the proponents of huge change. We owe them a great deal, more than we realise, into our own age. And I'm going to leave it there, actually.
Yeah, thank you.
But I don't think they are contradictions. Yeah. I think they are things that ripple through the world forever.
Yeah, maybe it's speaking to that sort of, the release of this work into the world and then into people's homes. And I think there's been some really interesting work about image technologies and reproduction in the 19th century and how some of these images then made it into people's living spaces. I don't know whether, Carol, you wanted to pick up on that. Thank you.
I think it's a really great comment, and I don't think there are opposites at all. And so many of us have been mentioning what reproduction we had on our wall when we were children, and what was the first image that got us, and it was very rarely a real image. It was usually something we'd seen in a poster or something. But I think the other point is that the Rossettis themselves were actually living in that world, where those paraphyletic ideas are sort of becoming actualized. And so, for example, I was just reading the other day, I didn't know this before, that Rossetti died in one of the first bungalows to be built in this country by the architect Siddal, who built the first bungalows, and somebody was thinking, oh, was he the first person to die in a bungalow? So that sort of architecture you were mentioning was part of their world as well.
I like it, keeping it real. Were there any other? Oh, here we go. I've got there's a question here.
Thank you, Sarah. Can I be heard?
Yes,
okay.
yeah.
I'm Peter Trippi. I want to underscore our thanks to Carol and her colleagues for this exhibition, because it really is a total labor of love. I can only imagine how difficult it's been, and thank you for going through with it. That leads me to the general point that mounting exhibitions of this kind is incredibly difficult and getting harder all the time because of expense and anxiety about security and attendance and so on. It leads me to make a plea to everyone in this room, and especially the folks on the stage. Can we develop digital initiatives that will address what you've just been chatting about, to broaden the stories, to put more figures into the tale-telling, possibly even to rename our studies, our area? Could we find funding sources for research by all these talented, fresh scholars around us, and then take it out through the internet? I mean, you all have developed amazing digital resources already. And I just want to put it out there as something to think about in the future, because I think that might be a really practical way to move forward. Not canceling exhibitions in person, that would be terrible, but we recognize that they're really challenging to do.
I mean, Liz and I were just talking about this over lunch, that and perhaps you should speak to it, but the range of textual resources, the kind of primary research which we've seen coming up on the screen requires huge amounts of travel, burning a hole in the ozone layer, etc. The library's only open from 11 till 3, etc. on a Tuesday. If those things were digitized and also edited, with a scholarly apparatus, which meant that you didn't have to look up and Google every squiggle to see what and so on. I mean, this is the way forward for new research. One of the reasons we all work on the same artists is because they're the ones who have published.
We've got the materials
and we have
for
the materials for. But
that's good. There should be an art historical equivalent of national service, so everybody when they get their PhD has to spend 2 years editing some significant text before they do anything else, something like that.
And it's interesting,
because exactly. I mean, it is the problem, because of course it's as Sarah and everybody at the PMC very well knows, it isn't a matter of just taking a scan of the letter. There's a huge amount of work that has to go into it to make it available in digital form. But that also leads to what I was going to say, because I just really wanted to second what Carol said about the conservation team, because so much of the behind the scenes work that we just sort of take for granted. We think, oh, that looks amazing. Well, there's a reason it looks amazing. But also, that's a reason why artists get neglected, is that their work doesn't look so good because it hasn't had the investment in it. And we've got to be honest about that. It hasn't had, Joyce Townsend and her team, going through it with a fine-tooth comb and making sure that we can see the point to it by, really seeing the best of it. So that's why exhibitions are quite difficult to do. But it's also why it's so difficult to sort of change the usual hierarchies of the artists we look at, and indeed the works we look at.
And I was thinking about in terms of scale, because, especially when you're dealing with smaller works on paper, or photography is also very challenging climatically to display. And galleries, the rooms are often, they're big, aren't they? And thinking about how you create
And
then...
flat objects are so much easier.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
You know, they're sort of made, aren't they, to view on the wall in that sort of relationship. And I think, you know, you can really see in this exhibition you're grappling with the kind of that work that you have to do to, you know, look and display a work of intimacy. And I think that's really interesting as well. That kind of speaks to people, the close looking, the kind of different forms you could do when you're looking at a reproduction of something in a book or online, to the work, the embodied encounter you have in an exhibition.
I love that phrase, work of intimacy. And James and I had, just thinking about technology, James and I had many conversations as well as sort of explorations of how to, alternative ways, so bringing a bit of digital technology into the exhibition, using facsimiles, which we did do, and using reproductions at different sizes, but we sort of... we agonised about it a lot, didn't we?
And sound, amazing sound,
yeah.
sound clouds.
Yeah, and some of those facsimiles were just because it is harder to do exhibitions now. Other ones were to allow people to be closer to things than they might otherwise get that aren't the sort of standard format.
Can I say one time?
Yeah,
Just
of
as a
course.
footnote to that, which is actually Victoria Osborne here is fighting the good fight for the Victorians in the Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery, which is heroic work. But the great collections of this material are in the smaller towns and cities around this country, which are not receiving the support that they used to get. And if there are any idle billionaires in the audience, please write a check. It's great to see Bolton City Art Gallery and Leeds City Art Gallery lending to this show. That's the resource that's underused.
Yeah. I saw a hand here. Look, we're not going to get to all of these questions. I'm going to disappoint you now, but because I know we have to wrap up because of the room, but we can perhaps have informal chat outside. So I'm saying apologies to you if you've been waving at me, but...
I'll be quick. Thinking about the digital, I think is really interesting because I haven't been over here since 2015, and I snuck in and I was like, I need to see The Beloved before I give my talk because I want to be sure that what I'm saying, I at least think it's true. And right, so like there's something about the work I'm doing now that's very, very haptically focused and being able to see paint on canvas in a way that most digital archives I've looked at really don't quite get yet. And I don't know if that's a technology question or a funding question, but it was really exciting for me. I was like, okay, I went and I saw it. I'm okay. But I mean, like it's wonderful to be here and to have an opportunity to actually see this stuff. I mean, Delaware is a tremendous resource, but yeah, it's just like it was really exciting for me to be like, oh, okay, so that the things I think about the texture of this painting are real. The things that I'm surmising based on my computer screen. So it was that kind of haptic intimacy I think is really important, and to whatever extent it can be created digitally, I think it's great.
Great. Well, maybe on haptic intimacy, we might draw it to the close for the formal part, but the sun is shining, there's those lovely gardens. I'm sure people will stick around for conversation and chat if you can. I just want to say again, thank you so much to everyone in the room. Like I said, I feel like it's been a real community of response. Again, talking about all the behind the scenes labour, I do want to say thank you so much to my colleagues at the PMC. Many of you have been in touch with Ella Fleming, our events lead at the back. And our other colleagues and our colleagues at Tate, especially in the AV box, because I think we've been beautifully amplified. It's felt absolutely a wonderful experience to listen to the papers, but particularly speakers. Thank you so much. Many of you are PhD students and early career scholars, and I have to say, my socks have been blown right off, so I wore sandals, because the level of scholarship is quite astounding. Some people are giving papers for the first time at public events. You've delivered with such panache and professionalism, which has made it so enjoyable and has created this atmosphere of conviviality and pleasure and joy for being together. So thank you so much to my colleagues here, especially to the University of York, but particularly we want to say salute, brava to Carol Jacobi and James at Tate.